Yeah, so what schools did you go to?
Well, I kind of went to boys' schools all my life, and I went to private schools. I was I would skip grades. I was a gifted child, so I was in private schools and skipping grades. So, and then I went. When I ended up at college, it was Williams College up in Massachusetts, which was another just all-boys school.
Yeah.
It became co-ed after I left. I don't think it had any. Well, interestingly enough, my father was a very conservative Republican. We know when we came over. I mean, very old line Southern family. I'm the descendant of people who owned slaves. My father's grandfather founded the town of Anniston, Alabama, in which we were in. So he was very conservative. My mother was not so much. We used to say they had a liberal Democrat and a conservative Republican. So my dad said, we just cancel each other's vote out. So I was the radical. I was the oldest of 5. And I went up to Williams, and my father, graduated high school in 63, so I was class of 67 at Williams. So I was at Williams right in that middle period of the 60s. And my father said that nobody else goes north to school. So my brother went to Virginia, my brother went to Washington Lee, and my 2 sisters went to Randolph-Macon, all in Virginia. But no one went north to school. He said it was the north that radicalized me. As I said, I was in Alabama in the south, and Anniston is where they burned a bus in the early 60s with the Freedom Riders. And I was very much... The interesting thing about growing up in the South is you knew black people on a much more personal basis. I would say the worst racism I ever experienced is when I went up to Williams and did a tutorial for black kids in North Adams, Mass., which was an industrial town. And the worst racists I encountered were Massachusetts working class whites. Now, the South had Jim Crow, which is horrible, and there's no excuse for the South, but I just saw, I don't know, I had a sense my mother was very liberal, but there wasn't an overt thing. And I remember I used to argue with all my peers, who were all my best friends, Jack Smith, Peyton Roberts, who were my 2 best friends. We used to argue all the time when all this sit-ins were happening in the early 60s about it. And it just came from a sense of fair play. The civil rights was my first big thing, yeah, that was what started me on the train. But I still believe deeply in America. That was the thing that all of us, and there's this woman who was a Weather Underground person who's right now, she's a professor of English at the University of Washington. She was back in the day. And she has written a play called With the Weatherman, and I went up to see a early rehearsal performance of it. And what she lacked, and I said, remember, Kit, that we all started as nice liberal believers in America. You know, we were all Kennedy.
Yeah.
Kennedy was our God, and Kennedy, said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you could do for your country. And we all set out to do things for our country.
Yeah.
And I saw civil rights as this thing that I was going to be engaged in. And then the war came, and I thought that was against it. So but we believed in America. We thought all these things were against the American ideal. That racism and denial of rights to a group of people was against the American ideal. That the total invasion and bombing of a small Asian country was against the American ideal. That we were acting as Americans.
Yeah.
That things had been flipped. The ones in power were not there. I was a congressional intern in '65, but closer to the families. So I worked in D.C. that summer. And it was when the Voting Rights Act was passed. And my parents were living in Norfolk, Virginia at that point, which was about a 3-hour drive. And I was going to go home for the weekend. And Friday night, I remember they passed it about 2 a.m. Saturday morning. I remember staying up in the House gallery. And it was just a magic moment. Lyndon Johnson, who would later become our bête noire, was, oh my God, yes, yeah, and it was just a great moment. I always remember that as a great moment of the passing of the Voting Rights Act, which they're trying to overdo now. So that was our driving train, and we were just trying to make America right, get it back to its ideals. Now, after college, I got into law school. I did very like it, and my dad had said, "That's fine. How are you going to pay for it?" I said, "What do you mean? I'm a spoiled kid, you know? What do you mean? Aren't you paying for it? I'm not paying for it yet. Figure out to do something, you know." So it was like, oh, I have to figure out to do something, you know. But he wanted me to go to, officers candidate school, naval officer. I'd get you out of the draft. He didn't want me to get dead. I said, no, I think I'm going to do VISTA. Now, VISTA then was called Volunteers. It was an acronym for Volunteers in Service to America. It was the Domestic Peace Corps, where you went and you worked in either an Indian reservation, poor farming community in Mississippi, a mining community in Kentucky, or an urban community in the ghetto. And you got $15 a week. So I opted for VISTA, Volunteer in Service to America. It was really interesting. Our group of VISTAs, and it was, Kennedy had started it, so it was not more than 5 years old. It doesn't exist anymore. It was the first time there were more boys than girls, and more men than women. We're all college grads. Because it was drafted to something. But, so I was in VISTA, and I trained in Baltimore. Now because of my civil rights activities, had developed relationships with some prominent blacks. And one was Floyd McKissick, who was the head of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, in Baltimore. And so I was Southie. And public housing, and I would go to parties, and I knew a lot of SNCC people who had been in SNCC when they were white and were kicked out, and I had had some affiliation with SNCC.
Yeah.
Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and all the whites were kicked out, which was right at that time. The blacks were, doing it, and so I'd go to parties, and Stokely would be there, and so I was called in and told that I shouldn't hang with these guys. The government's kind of, I'm there in D.C., so I said, well, this is really bad. So then I was with this guy, Joe Brennan, who wasn't a VISTA, but was a community organizer, had been trained in Chicago at the Woodlawn Project, I don't know. And he was a great community organizer. And the public housing down in Anacostia was all owned by the federal government, because D.C. is a federal city. And it was just awful shape. So he and I organized a tenants' rent strike at the public housing. They weren't going to pay their rent to the government until they cleaned up the place. So I got called in to the National Vista office then. And they said, you can't do this. Those are federal property. And all of a sudden, it began to click for me. I began to see this is the beginning of a turning away from America. Before, it's just that I'm doing the American ideal work. At that point in Vietnam, one of the United States' strategies was called strategic hamlets, in which they would put people in a community to basically organize against the National Liberation Front or the Viet Cong, and just make a peaceful community. And I all of a sudden realized that what we were, in order to keep it down, to keep them from going total NLF, basically under force of arms. And I said, that's what we are viewed. It's the strategic hamlet program at home. We're just there to keep them from rioting. Not to really affect change. But the riots had been raging all in 67, etc. So I then wrote a letter to National Vista and resigned at that point. And that was February of 68, I believe. I started in September of 67, so I did about 6 months, yeah. And I went down to, so now I was totally draft eligible. And they hadn't, actually, my draft board had not granted a permit for VISTA, but, so I went down to talk to some people at the Washington Draft Resistance Unit. And I met this woman, Kathy Wilkerson there, and she was doing that. And so we became good. She said, I'm thinking starting an SDS chapter here. Is Trafford's, I want to move beyond. We got to be against the word.